Good morning. We're going to pop into the Old Testament today to the book of Joshua, the first chapter. I've been thinking a lot about Joshua the last few days and thinking about his life, really, his life story. We tend to think that Joshua's life almost started at the beginning of the book of Joshua, when he came to prominence, when Moses had died and he was the one going into the promised land, leading the people. And we have all his adventures written in the book of Joshua. But he had lived probably about 70 years, maybe 80 years before the beginning of the book of Joshua. He was a contemporary of Caleb, who was able to say to Joshua, I have served the Lord for these 80 years. Now give me this mountain. Caleb and Joshua were the two spies that came back from the promised land along with the other 10 and gave a favourable report. They didn't deny that there were giants in the land and there were great fortified cities, and they didn't deny that it was a very fruitful land. But what they did say was, the Lord is with us, therefore we can take the land as he told us to. Whereas the other 10 said, we're like grasshoppers in their sight, we can't possibly do it. But that was 40 years before the beginning of the book of Joshua. And Joshua was already 35 years at least when he went spying out in the promised land. And Joshua had spent 40 years serving Moses as his right-hand man, as his minister, as his support. We find that in the first 5 books we hear about Joshua. So this was not an inexperienced man. This was not a man who didn't know. He knew Moses as closely as anybody could possibly know Moses, and he had learned at his feet. And he had worked with him, he'd stood with him in battle, he had watched Moses lead. He was a mature spiritual man. After all, he went into the promised land and he came back saying, if God told us we can have it, we can have it. He was brave. He stood against the opinion of 10 of his peers. He stood and spoke out the truth. But the other side to it is that he was human. He was human. At the beginning of the book of Joshua, he and Caleb were the only 2 of their generation, the generation that had left Egypt. They were the only 2 left alive, because they wandered in the wilderness until the whole of that generation had died. So they knew a lot of sorrow and a lot of bereavement. And also, Joshua had just lost his closest companion and the great leader Moses, and the entire nation he was leading was in bereavement, was sad. And it was to this man, in this situation, that God said, be strong and of good courage. Only be strong and very courageous, in the first chapter of Joshua. And that what I want to say to you and me really is that even when we have been following the Lord closely for a long time, there may come times when something has happened in our life, something has shaken us. And in the natural, our confidence has gone. Our trust has gone. We are standing on, as it were, shaky ground. And suddenly we're faced with something that the Lord asks us to do, and we just don't feel we can do it. It's all too much. It might be a bereavement that causes that. It might be other losses that cause that. But Joshua had his hands full of bereavement, and he had a people he was leading whose great leader had gone. And naturally enough, he would think, I'm sure, will they follow me like they followed Moses? Can I step into his shoes? Can I don't think I can. And God met with him. God didn't say to him, you stupid man, what are you weak and what are you don't you trust me? He didn't. He understood. God understood. And the thing that he said to Joshua was, in verse 5 of Joshua 1, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. He said to Joshua the words Joshua needed to know, that where his faith, his trust, his strength was failing, God would not desert him. God would be everything to him that he needed. The only thing he had to do was be strong and of good courage and trust the promise that God would be with him and that God would lead him, and the promises that had been made to Moses that were not yet fulfilled of bringing the people into the land flowing with milk and honey would be fulfilled in his lifetime. And they were. We're fortunate. We see the end of the story, don't we? We see the end of the story. We see that Joshua led them into the promised land. They settled everywhere. And those great cities fell in front of them as they stepped out in faith. But take courage. Even a man as great as Joshua got scared, lost his confidence, quaked, shook because of all the accumulation of things that he'd lived through. And he needed that word from God, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you nor forsake you. And we have the words of Jesus, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will be with you and in you. All you have to do is abide in me. Stay linked to the vine. Don't break that linkage. Don't trust in your own strength. Trust in the promises of God. Because your strength, no matter how long you've been a Christian, could fail at any moment. But the one thing that will never fail is the fulfillment of the promises of God in your life and in mine. Time is up. I'll see you again tomorrow. God bless you. Bye-bye for now.